looking at President Biden there finishing his remarks in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania on the issue of crime. He sought to reframe the narrative on Democrats in crime, calling to fund the police, not to defund it. He touted recent successes, including bipartisan gun legislation. And as you heard just seconds ago, he took aim at Republicans. My MAGA Republican friends, he described them, invoking the insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th and criticizing those Republicans who have not denounced and condemned those attacks. He said, for God's sakes, whose side are you on? He also criticized Republican attacks on the FBI following its search of the president's home, the former president's home in Florida. We're going to talk a lot more about President Biden's remarks in just a moment from now. But the bottom line here, with exactly 10 weeks until midterms and control of the Congress on the line, the White House is signaling it is not holding back on a new line of attacks on the GOP. President Biden speaking after his first midterm season rally last week, where he called elements of the hard right semi-fascism while speaking with a group of donors. It comes as President Biden is ramping up his travel schedule. It's going to return him to Pennsylvania again later this week. On Thursday, he'll deliver a primetime speech from Philadelphia's Independence Hall. A White House official telling NBC News that that address will be framed as a, quote, continued battle for the soul of the nation. A direct parallel, of course, to his 2020 campaign kickoff in Philadelphia, where then candidate Biden offered himself as a defender of democracy against President Trump. Now, with Mr. Trump not on the ballot himself in November, the White House is trying to tie Republicans who are to Trump's ideology. The speech Thursday is expected to invoke the fight for personal rights, likely an emphasis on the ongoing abortion rights fight in the country, an issue that has already helped to galvanize Democrats and grown that gap between Democrats and Republicans in this country. Also led to some Republican candidates scrambling to try to moderate, even to backpedal, erase if they could, their positions after election results in Kansas and in upstate New York this month. And yet the president's travel blitz comes as Democrats remain hesitant to attach themselves to him, according to new reporting from NBC News. Case in point, even on his home turf of Pennsylvania this week, Democratic Senate candidate John Fetterman, who's facing Republican nominee Dr. Mehmet Oz, is not appearing at the Wilkes-Barre event. But a Fetterman spokesperson said he will be talking to Biden in Pittsburgh when the president visits on Labor Day. President Biden expected to be there for the Labor Day parade. Gubernatorial candidate Josh Shapiro, who's running against the far-right GOP candidate Doug Mastriano, will only be appearing in, quote, his official capacity as Attorney General, his spokesperson told NBC News. Their caution reflects what is shaping up to be a highly unusual midterm year, where so many of the old rules of midterm politics are being questioned. And joining me now to talk about all of it, to preview the road ahead for the president, is NBC News White House correspondent Monica Alba. Also with me, senior national political reporter Natasha Korecki and Capitol Hill reporter for us, fortunately, at NBC News, Sahil Kapur. Monica, let me get to you. We just saw the president back out on the trail in Pennsylvania. He'll be there 3 times over 7 days. What struck you in this speech? Clearly, the president's trying to flip the script on the Republican narrative on crime, but it was the end. It was the punctuation, the exclamation point, you might say. But the president really laid into those Republicans on this issue to close out his remarks.
Absolutely, Peter. That's what stood out to me as well. The fact that the president had been talking about these crime prevention programs, but then at the end, he really wanted to make the contrast the clearest he could possibly in these terms. And we were told by the White House that he was going to be fiery and a bit more aggressive than he has been maybe out on the trail today, and that was certainly the case. I want to read to you just a couple of those quotes that we are emphasizing and talking about here when he said, "Don't tell me you support law enforcement if you won't condemn what happened on January 6th. Whose side are you on? You're either on the side of the mob or you're on the side of the police," emphasizing you can't be pro-law enforcement and pro-insurrection. So
Monica, let me cut you off briefly. I want to play that sound. We just put it together. The president saying it just moments ago, so folks who missed it can hear it for themselves. Here, there's that soundbite.
So let me say this to my MAGA Republican friends in Congress. Don't tell me you support law enforcement if you won't condemn what happened on the 6th. Don't tell me. Can't do it. For God's sake, whose side are you on?
A little bit of fire from the president on this issue, certainly.
Absolutely, and this is something that we know the president had planned to talk about for some time. This event was supposed to take place about a month ago. He was already scheduled to be in Wilkes-Barre, and then he got COVID, and then he had that rebound infection, so he was off the trail for most of August. But what's notable also about today is a new strategy that the White House went after, and that's because of everything we saw happen in the last couple of weeks with the lawfully executed FBI search and seizure down at Mar-a-Lago, because former President Trump took classified documents from the White House to his residence. So in the context of all of that, following, some Republicans and some of the former president's supporters had been calling to defund the FBI. So President Biden took the opportunity today to really express what he said was sickening about those recent threats to FBI, and that he said, again, of course, the FBI was carrying out their duty and following the law. So it's notable that he also had that line of attack against some Republicans, because that's obviously not something that would have taken place a month ago. So the White House trying out this multi-pronged strategy, talking about crime, talking about law and order, but also specifically, Peter, about gun violence, and the president reiterating that he does want to ban all assault weapons. We know that wasn't something that was part of the bipartisan gun legislation that was signed earlier this year, but that is something that the president wants to be able to do, and that he said he's going to continue to call out any Republicans who don't support that ahead of the November midterms.
You know, Monica, even some Republican strategists that I spoke to over the course of the last several days said they couldn't wrap their head around why any Republicans would have been touting that early line, defund the FBI, despite their frustration about the siege, as it were, with a search warrant that took place at the former president's home a bit earlier. But this does sort of offer a runway to what we think we're going to hear from the president when he speaks from Philadelphia in front of Independence Hall on Thursday. This is the Soul of the Nation speech. Again, it seems like that's sort of a further amplification of this issue about freedoms and rights being at stake, and also trying to draw that contrast between his administration and these MAGA Republicans.
That's certainly correct, Peter. And the president is going to be talking about this, we're told, in broader strokes. He's going to zoom out and really put into the bigger picture what's at stake here for, in the words of a White House official, protecting our rights, protecting our freedoms, and protecting our democracy. So they're going to do that by sort of using the old campaign slogan, the battle for the soul of the nation, but with a bit of a remix, and trying to update it ahead of the midterm elections as a sort of testing ground, again, for that strategy. So the president is going to be evoking our founding fathers, talking, of course, at Independence Hall in Philadelphia, and he's also going to be talking about what he feels he's been able to make some progress on when it comes to preserving democracy in the last 2 years of his administration, but all the work he feels that still needs to be done. And notably there, he did talk a little bit about America's standing on the world stage. That's something I'm also told he's going to be referencing on Thursday, and trying to make the point that he wants to be able to make these statements to other world leaders that he feels America is back. Notable there that he disclosed that French President Emmanuel Macron replied to him when he said that recently, for how long, Peter? Yeah,
it's a good point, Monica. I got to tell you, having seen the president when he was on the departing of Marine One on Friday, there's sort of a swagger to this president right now that you haven't seen in a while, a sense of confidence. They're feeling good about where things are, about gas prices coming down, about some other things going their way, the legislative achievements that they've had over the course of the last several months, including that giant climate change plan. Natasha, I want to bring you into this conversation. You have new reporting today, though, that some Democrats, despite all of that, are still a bit hesitant to campaign with the president, even after this slate of wins. So sort of help us understand the current dynamic right now between President Biden and those Democratic campaigns.
Sure thing. I mean, the most obvious reason right now is, even though Biden has had this streak of wins, lots of legislative wins, lots of great headlines, his poll numbers are still not as high as Democrats. They're really in the 40s still. And in these battleground states, these Senate candidates in particular are really fighting for their campaigns, and they're outperforming Biden. So that's a real simple answer. But, other things that campaigns have told us is they like this narrative now. They like where they're headed. They like that extremism is on the ballot, and they want to keep that narrative intact. They don't want to go anywhere near gas prices, even though they are going up, still not great, or inflation and the economy, all issues that are, one of the top issues for voters. But as we talk about some of what Biden's going into on Thursday and beyond, I mean, this is really Biden's sweet spot. He wants to talk about democracy. He wants to go back to the 2020 race. And I've had lots of Democratic strategists say they feel like the GOP is sort of playing into their hands. I mean, it's like, one example after another, and they love the fact that Trump continues to be in the news. So all of these things are good for Democrats, but still, Democrats don't feel like they're good enough to really be on stage one-on-one right next to Biden. They don't want to open themselves up to attacks because every state is so different than what we're looking at nationally.
Yeah, so much of this is case by case, district by district, state by state. As you note there, Natasha, I want to play for a moment something that struck me in the president's remarks. He appeared to be reacting to the words of the Republican senator from South Carolina, Lindsey Graham, who just a couple of days ago, I think late Sunday, indicated that if President Trump is indicted for his mishandling of classified documents, that there would be riots in the street. Notably, those comments coming just 20 months after January 6th took place in this country. Here's the president's apparent reaction to those words. Listen.
No one expects politics to be a patty cake. It sometimes gets mean as hell. But the idea you turn on a television and see senior senators and congressmen saying, if such and such happens, there'll be blood in the street. Where the hell are we?
Sahil Kapur is joining us. Sahil, I want your take on that. That was, the two men, Lindsey Graham and Joe Biden, they were friendly for a long time. Obviously, a lot changed over the course of the last several years, but this was a pretty good slam at his former colleague across the aisle.
Yes, Peter, it was an emphatic condemnation of what he described as MAGA Republicans, this violent rhetoric that, President Biden seemed to come alive on when, denouncing it. He talked about the riot on this Capitol on January 6th, repeatedly talked about the so-called MAGA Republicans who soft-pedaled that. Some of them, at least some on the far right, called those who marched on the Capitol patriots. Some of them downplayed it. There were talks of, among certain House Republicans calling it a tourist visit. Which is a preposterous claim, but Biden repeatedly went after Republicans for making those claims and connected it to his broader arc on crime. He was around in the 80s and 90s. He knows how devastating attacks on crime can be to the Democratic Party when they're perceived as, being on the wrong side of it. And this was his attempt to kind of snuff that out early on and flip that narrative by talking about the Trump-allied Republicans who have not emphatically condemned the attack on the Capitol. He also talked about, defunding the police. He's always been against that ever since that first came out in 2020. He reiterated his position on that, but he also said he's against defunding the FBI, something that certain allies of Trump, including some right-wing members of the House of Representatives, have said in the wake of that search of Mar-a-Lago. So it's an attempt by the president to flip the narrative, but he seemed quite, unusually passionate when talking about that. He ended by mentioning, where in God's name is the old United States of America? Let's get back to that. That was the most vintage Biden line of that speech, I thought.
Yeah, no doubt. I think that gives us a pretty good template, as it were, for what we're going to hear from the president over the course of the next 70 days, now 10 weeks out to those midterms.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.